I think Scoop wanted to be a politician from the day he was born. He used to talk to us about it.
During our very young days, we plastered the city with posters and billboards for Scoop.
Henry was the hardest working candidate I ever knew. It was hard for him, but he worked at it.
And she says, Henry, what do you want to be when you grow up? And Henry said, Mrs. Dewson, I want to be president.
In 1940, Henry M. Jackson, known throughout his life as Scoop, was elected to the United States Congress and began a public career that spanned 43 years and 9 presidents. This man of political power and influence did not come from one of this nation's prestigious eastern cities. He came from the rough-and-tumble town of Everett, Washington. This is the story of young Scoop Jackson between 1912 and 1940, as told by the people of Everett.
He was just a neat, clean, well-adjusted young man that seemed to be older than his years and seemed to know somehow, some way, where he was going and what he was trying to be.
Everett is essentially a peninsula that in early days was surrounded by a ring of sawmills. All the sawmills had their own large burners, which extruded a large amount of smoke and cinders throughout the entire Everett area.
It was a rough town, and loggers could come in from the woods, and mill workers and maritime people and tugboat people liked a certain amount of excitement on the weekends, so this was pretty much a wide open town. There were pleasure houses at both ends of Hewitt Avenue, both on the river and the bay. They're called, often referred to as houses of ill repute, but actually they had very good reputations. They were just in sort of a seedy business. The social structure of the town was simple. There were a ruling hierarchy on the top, and then there was a great group of people which were the workforce. To me, there was no great middle class in Everett at that time.
They were all working people, many Norwegian, Danish, a few Swedish people, and quite a number of German people.
Among the many immigrants were 2 young Norwegians, Peter Jackson and Marine Anderson. They married in Everett in 1897.
The father, Pete Jackson, was a hard-working fellow. He worked at a variety of tasks, such as a laborer, helper at Sumner Iron Works, a small concrete contractor.
He built basements, and he built all the best basements in town, and everybody that had a basement that Mr. Jackson built was very proud of it.
The mother was a simple, a hard-working woman, totally dedicated to the welfare of her family.
Then Gertrude was a school teacher in the 3rd grade at Garfield School for most of her life. Marie stayed at home, took care of the folks, never did get married.
There was a brother, Arthur, who doesn't appear much in the local scene. I really didn't know anything about him except he was ill a good part of his life. So they lavished all the care and all their hopes and dreams on Scoop, making sure that he did everything they wanted him to do, among which was being a great success.
Well, Scoop and I think about that time, we were probably 4 or 5 or 6 years of age, and Scoop got a hold of some of the kitchen matches from his home. I got a hold of some newspapers, and Kitty Corner, from where we lived, was a open field at that time. It's a playground now, but that time it was full of dried grass. And we set fire to it, hoping that the fire trucks would come. Well, the fire grew rather fast toward the house right down the street. The neighbors rushed out, were able to put the fire out. Scoop and I ran down an alley, around the block, and when I got home, my mother was waiting for me. She got me and took me down to the Jackson house, and Mrs. Jackson, my mother, looked for Scoop, and they found him underneath the middle of the bed and hauled him out.
We went to Longfellow School. In fact, both Scoop and I started the first grade there together. When the bell would ring, you would line up either on the side door by the stairs or by the front door. And upstairs there would be a piano, but you marched. Under the Double Eagle was what we used to play. It was a very different kind of a sense of schooling. It was a very secure and had the feeling of just comfortableness. When we started, that is when Scoop and I started South Junior High School, one of the outstanding teachers there, we felt, was Ellen Reap, a very beautiful person. She had the most gorgeous red hair, and she was enthusiastic about what she was teaching.
So I would have the students debate issues. And Jackson was a very good debater because he was extremely thorough and was sure that he had his facts before he said anything. Well, and in order to make them aware of the world at large and their own community, I used to have them impersonate a newscaster from France, one from Germany, one from Great Britain, one from China, etc. So you were practically a citizen of the world before the students got through. But it gave them an understanding that the world was much larger than just Everett.
We decided at the 8th grade that we'd go for a hike. And we picked a rather daring hike when you look at it now, but we were going in around the base of Glacier Peak. We took this trip up into the mountains, 3 boys, Ivan Rimstead, Henry Scoop Jackson, and myself, and we were gone just a little over a week. We had rather crude equipment. I had a homemade sleeping bag together with my share of the food, must have made my pack about 30 pounds, and it was pretty heavy going. And none of this fancy dehydrated food like you had today. We broke our eggs in a glass mayonnaise jar because we couldn't carry the whole egg. That would be dangerous. And we had bacon, and we had butter, and we had bread, and we had, of course, the inevitable pancake flour. And fishing was very good in those rivers in those days. I've always believed that trip around Glacier Peak, which Jackson and Rimstead and I took in 1925, did 2 things for Jackson and maybe 2 things for this country. One, I think it acquainted Scoop with the joys and pleasures and beauty of the wilderness. And the second thing, I think it made an environmentalist out of him long before the word was ever heard of or it had become popular.
Scoop's outdoor activities were diversions for a young man who was quickly developing a strong desire for leadership. At Everett High School, his thoughts were often on politics, and he frequently voiced his concerns about issues that he felt were of vital importance to America.
But back in high school, he first talked about the threat that Japan could be and how they could invade the country. We had no protection. And in those years at noon we had brown bag it and go for walks, and he had expound that argument. And well, it got to be rather a tiresome subject. And at that same time it happened that the longshoremen were having trouble with some other group in town. And so anyway, so when he had to mention Japan was going to invade, I said, "Don't worry, Scoop. The longshoremen wouldn't let him in anyway." But he was so bad in sense of humor. He was so mad that he didn't see any humor in it at all. He didn't speak to me for a couple of weeks.
Well, I first met Scoop Jackson in the Masonic Temple in Everett when he was just beginning high school and I was a senior. This was in a Demolay initiatory ceremony in which a ritual that presented love of God, love of country, respect and love for parents, brotherhood of man, good citizenship was emphasized.
Well, Scoop and I were both quite active in the Demolay and on the drill team. We practiced and practiced, and we were sent over our drill team to Spokane along with drill teams from Tacoma and Bellingham and Yakima and everywhere to compete. We were put up in a dump hotel called a Coeur d'Alene Hotel there, and Scoop and I shared one room. That I guess we didn't lock the door that night because someone switched the light on. A lady came in, I'll call her a lady, said she was a nurse, and immediately jumped in bed with Scoop and said, "I'm going to take care of you." And Scoop really kicked her out fast, because I tell you, Scoop was a very high moral caliber, he was. He kicked her out. But I think one of our fellow Demolays didn't.
When we all graduated from high school, we were terribly excited because we were down in the Everett Theater, which at that point, as I remember, was rather new. Scoop was one of the speakers, and if I remember correctly, he spoke a fairly long time.
We all said we were never going to stay in Everett. We were all going to go someplace else. Who would want to stay in this hick town? And Henry always said, "I'm going to stay here, and this is where I'll start my career." And he knew his career was going to be politics. There's no doubt about it.
Jackson's motivation was that Henry, I think from the day he graduated from high school, his ambition was national politics. That was going to be his vocation.
He didn't want away from this town.
Yes, Scoop came from Everett High School equipped with an old red sweater and with hair that stuck up straight up in the air all the way around his head. But fellows at the Delta Chi fraternity thought this young fella had a lot of possibilities. And besides that, we needed pledges. So as soon as he was pledged, one of the fellows got him in an automobile and took him down to a barber shop on the avenue, put him in a barber chair and said to the barber, "Cut it short." And that changed Scoop's life, I'm sure. He never would have made it in politics without that short haircut. And we found that indeed we had a diamond in the rough who polished very well.
Scoop graduated from the University of Washington in 1935 with short hair and a law degree. He returned to Everett, but Everett was not the same industrious mill town he had left 5 years before. Scoop had not yet passed his bar exam, so he took a temporary job with the Federal Emergency Relief Agency.
I think Scoop was 23 years of age when he came to work for the Welfare Department.
What we were home visitors. We evaluated their applications and visited their homes and more or less determined whether or not they were eligible for this program.
It was a very difficult time in Everett. One man, as I remember, brought his underwear in to show me how badly he needed underwear. One man, I remember, ate peanuts constantly, and he just reeked of peanuts whenever he came. That's all he had to eat.
And the people here were predominantly immigrants from Northern Europe. All the people were, there was a tremendous group, maybe 40 or 50% of the people were out of work. And they were embarrassed about it. Their whole livelihood was built around it. Their family life, everything was built around it. And Jackson, he was a part of them. And he was one of them. And he was seeing this. This was his kind of people that were being affected. Yes, I would say it had a very great effect on him.
He came out, he had a feeling of empathy for the poor and the downtrodden. And I think he realized the suffering that people were going through. And although he was quite a conservative person, I think probably might have been a Republican if it hadn't been for the Depression. And I think that molded his thinking a great deal.
Following his experience with the relief agency, Scoop passed his bar exam and hired into the Everett law office of Lloyd Black, a prominent Everett attorney and a powerful Democrat.
Black was always interested in young people, and he took kind of a fatherly role as an advisor to everybody, and he told me that when Henry got talking about the future, and he said, well, Henry, if you want to be in business, be a Republican. But if you're going to be in politics, be a Democrat. So Henry became a Democrat.
And as a Democrat, Scoop Jackson began to make history. The young attorney practiced law in a town where breaking the law was almost a way of life. Illegal liquor, prostitution, and gambling all ran wide open. Snohomish County had a tolerance policy. The law enforcement agencies turned their backs on the lawbreakers at gambling establishments such as the ranch.
I can remember as a young woman going with my mother and father out to the ranch. There was liquor. There was dinner, there was gambling. It was as practically wide open as it could be. And after you had been there for a little while, you could casually walk over toward the back of the building and knock on a little door, and you were looked at, and the door was opened, and you went into the back where all of the gambling was.
The problem in 1938 was that the slot machines were in the restaurants and beer parlors. People would go there to have a drink. They have a little bit too much, maybe they start spending their money on the slot machines until they had nothing left. They'd go home, there wouldn't even be food for the children and the family.
I can remember they were paying off some of the officials in order to keep their game. I remember that clearly because I can remember them picking up the money in cigarette packages. Old Lucky Strike. And it was all supposed to be very quietly done. So how I happened to know about it, because it was told to me, and they showed me what they got.
I know one night my daddy spent $5 and he won $60, and Mother was so excited and made him put it in his pocket, and he came home and we bought a washing machine with it.
The king of gambling was Joe Hart. Hart arrived in Everett in about 1934 and quickly gained control of most of the gambling machines in the county.
Joe Hart was the big operator in the county, and he had the control of the gambling devices. Of going into the beer parlors and restaurants because he had influence or control to a certain extent on the Teamsters Union. And if you wanted to have a slot machine in your restaurant and it wasn't his, you're going to be in trouble. You wouldn't get delivery of the whatever may be necessary to operate your business. But that way he had a monopoly on the operation of slot machines.
My father was not a gangster, was not connected with the underworld, gangsters, or any of that thing, because my mother simply would not have tolerated it. My father's personality, to someone that didn't know him, was probably one that was rough, gruff, probably brusque. But anybody that actually knew him always remembers him as a very kind, warm-hearted, generous person.
Al Swanson was the prosecuting attorney of Snohomish County, and I think he was elected in about 1934. Well, I felt that Joe Hart was associated with Al Swanson, and I thought that Al, because he could have stopped this if he wished to, he could have seen to it through the sheriff's office by his influence and direction, could have stopped the slot machines which were in violation of the law.
Jackson wanted to run for public office, and Swanson was coming up for re-election. The Democratic Party was growing and strengthening in the county. The issues at stake, gambling and crime, were issues that Jackson could not tolerate. And so, in 1938, Henry M. Jackson entered politics.
Henry and I decided that somebody ought to beat Al Swanson, who was the present prosecuting attorney. And so Henry decided to run on the Democratic ticket, and I said I'd run on the Republican ticket.
I can't remember anything about specific arguments between the two, except Jackson's main theme was law and order, and he was determined to eliminate punch boards and pinball machines, and they enforced the law.
The campaign of 1938 was a wonderful campaign. As I look back on it, it was so different from any campaigns of this day. It was all footwork, all house to house, and it was a lot of pep rallies, meetings. We had great parades just to rouse everybody and get them enthused.
I remember so well seeing Scoop on my lunch hour on the corner of Wetmore and Hewitt Avenue, shaking hands. I heard it so many times. He said, "I'm Scoop Jackson, and I'm running for prosecutor."
He would be down at the mills meeting the men coming to work or going home from work.
Well, you realize that Snohomish County, which was Jackson's original political base, is somewhere between 23 and 25% Scandinavian. And Scoop was smart enough to know that this was an important political base. He was one of theirs. He had a Norwegian name. His mother and father were born in Norway. He played that crowd just like he'd play an accordion, and they really liked him. And years later, you'd go in a farmhouse or a humble home out in the country, and there was a wood-burning kitchen range in the kitchen, and there was a picture of Franklin Roosevelt on the wall, and almost without exception, there was a picture of Scoop Jackson on that same wall.
Johnny Salter and I were two of the ones that drove Scoop around to these coffee clutches and different meetings, particularly Scandinavian ones where the food was extremely rich and the conversation was extremely boring.
Republicans were not very popular in Snohomish County. Sometimes Henry and I would show up at a political rally at the same time, and Henry would get up and give his song and dance, and get wildly cheered, and very popular. And I'd get up and I'd get booed, even before I said anything.
The 1938 election night was always, for those involved and interested, who always went to the courthouse, Snohomish County Courthouse, and they had a huge blackboard up there with the candidates' names on them, and then they would write the votes in as they came in, and that was the way they were all tallied. And of course there was great glee, you know, when your candidate won.
Well, Henry was the big Democratic hopeful, I guess you might call it. Republicans at that time were at a rather low ebb, and I was soundly defeated by Henry in the final election.
When Scoop got elected, his pronouncement is that the county simply was not going to tolerate this anymore. So he clamped down. My understanding is that he gave my father essentially 2 months to get out of what they call running machines in Snohomish County, with which my father complied.
I know that Snohomish County became a far better place to live while he was prosecuting attorney, because he did a fairly outstanding piece of work there and showed his caliber as a leader.
With gambling and crime under control, Snohomish County seemed to be growing out of its reckless past. Then, 2 events propelled Jackson back into the headlines and kept him there. The first incident began on a stretch of highway near Marysville. Driving north from Everett were the Kolstads, a well-known Everett family. Southbound, Mrs. Vivian Reeves was returning from La Conner with most of her family. Although he was not traveling with his wife that night, Tom Reeves still recalls the tragic events of December 23, 1939.
My wife was a very poor driver. She didn't drive very much, just very little. She had run off the side of the road, and there was a ditch alongside of the highway, and she hit that, and she tried to pull the car back into the highway, and she pulled the wheels too far, and it flipped over, and then the car that coming down the hill plowed into the back end of our car.
Well, my sister-in-law, Bernice Kolstad, was on one side of me, and Mrs. Carter on the other side of me, and both of them were killed instantly, and that's all I remember.
7 people were dead. Vivian Reeves was tested and shown to have traces of alcohol in her bloodstream. She was charged with 7 counts of homicide and would face prosecuting attorney Henry Jackson in court. Reeves' attorney, John C. Richards, handled most serious felony cases in the county, and he knew his way around a jury.
He, as we lawyers or judges would say, put on the old shoe act. Now that is just simply the jurors would feel sorry for his client because he had such a rotten lawyer. But actually he was putting on an act. He did it all the time. Of course the jurors didn't know it, but he murdered the King's English, and but he was clever and he was smart. He was just a natural, gifted conniver, shall we say.
Scoop worked hard on that case, as he did on all of his cases, but he was sure that he would win that one because of the evidence. But he couldn't baffle John Richards.
And John Richards was a very colorful figure. But I know he argued to the jury that any alcoholic content in her bloodstream was due to the fact that she was consuming cough syrup that had a high alcoholic content. And the jury accepted that testimony, and the jury acquitted her on every count. And we were all surprised. I mean, that was an understatement.
Scoop Jackson had lost what many assumed would be an open and shut case. But the Reeves case had generated a lot of publicity. Now, almost everyone knew Henry Jackson. In the fall of 1939, 3 men came to the town of Arlington, northeast of Everett, to look for work in the logging camps. In the spring of 1940, 2 of those men were found dead in the forest. The murder weapon was found nearby. After an intensive manhunt, an ex-convict was arrested in Portland, charged with 2 counts of murder and sent to Everett. In the trial that followed, 2 names made headlines: the accused murderer, Edward Bouchard, and the prosecuting attorney, Henry Jackson.
Yes, I'll never forget Edward Bouchard. Scoop called me to come and take the testimony. They had this Bouchard at the sheriff's office, and it was in the evening, but he was a very nice-appearing man, very unassuming, and he wanted to die.
So he didn't say he wasn't going to go back to prison. He said, I'd rather take the rope and go back there. And so he didn't. The only time in that trial, so the trial that even opened his mouth, was when the Seattle detectives took the stand. I can't recall just what he said. I can't remember what he said, but I just remember the whole courtroom was startled. Just a low voice from the table: "You're a goddamn liar." It just killed everybody.
Scoop, we worked long hours on that case because it included testimony from people as far away as California. And he would have been very, very disappointed had he lost it, I'm sure.
But this time, Henry Jackson didn't lose. Edward Bouchard was found guilty and hanged at the Washington State Penitentiary.
So if you won a murder case and got the death penalty, it was a good victory. Just like a rookie getting up and hitting a home run.
Soon after the trial, another headline got people talking. Mon Walgren, the Democratic congressman from the 2nd Congressional District, announced his intention to run for the Senate. This left a vacancy in the House of Representatives. Within a month after Bouchard's guilty verdict, Henry Jackson announced his candidacy for Congress. The Democrats quickly endorsed Jackson as their candidate. Endorsement even came from an unexpected supporter, Joe Hart, the gambling king.
My dad always used to remark about the fact that when Henry came in as prosecuting attorney, that his only thought was, how do we get him out of the county? As soon as he found out that Henry was running for Congress, he generously supported that political campaign because, as far as he was concerned, the best thing for him is if Henry would get elected and be out of the county.
Well, I think the Bouchard case was it was highly publicized. And, of course, it brought Scoop's name out. He was a young attorney just getting acquainted in the area, and it spread the information not only in Snohomish County but other counties published the situation. And I think that was one of the things that helped him become elected to Congress from the 2nd District.
Scoop was only 28 years old and had only 2 years' experience in the political arena. Nonetheless, as it had many times before, good luck and good timing were with Scoop Jackson.
So that's the way it was. Scoop ran, and he was nominated. And he ran again in the general election, and he was elected to Congress.
I'm not sure myself what made him become what he did. But I think a part of it was a great luck, great fortuitous circumstances. I never knew how to describe this adequately, but I always thought he had his eye on the main chance, on some bigger and better thing down the road. When he had an opportunity to run for prosecuting attorney, that was just another step that any young attorney would take. But when this window of opportunity came for him to make a run at the Congress of the United States at such a tender age, and in a county that was strongly Democratic, in a nation that was Democratic trends were evidencing themselves, it was his chance. It was his chance to go for it, and so he just took a run at it, and it was his time, and it turned out good. All the time I knew him, I always felt he was very goal-oriented. He seemed to know what he wanted and have some idea of how to get there. And so he did it. He saw that window of opportunity and he took a shot at it. Well, the local story here in Everett about how Scoop Jackson got his name relates to a comic strip that was in the local Everett Herald. And Scoop's elder sister, Gertrude, seized upon that name and hung it on Scoop, and he apparently liked it because it followed him all through his career.
I've read many times that he got the name Scoop because of a cartoon character in one of the Everett papers. It's not true. His sisters, Gertrude Marie, named him after a reporter for the Everett Daily News, a morning paper.
But then I think officially, probably it was Mrs. Best at the Everett Herald who officially named him as Scoop Jackson, and then from there on.
The name Scoop, he got that at a very early age. So he was known all over town as Scoop Jackson.